At 23 minutes past 1 in the morning on the 26th of April, 1986, an engineer in the control room of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant pressed a button. It was the emergency shutdown button, the single most important safety control in the entire plant. Its whole purpose, its only purpose, was to stop the reactor instantly, to drop every control rod into the core, and kill the nuclear reaction in an emergency. It was the button you press when everything is going wrong and you need it all to stop. The big red handle. The last line of defense. He pressed it, and a few seconds later, the reactor exploded. Not despite the button. Because of it. The most destructive nuclear accident in history was not triggered by someone failing to shut the reactor down. It was triggered by someone shutting it down. The safety system did the killing. The button designed to prevent a catastrophe was the thing that caused one. Tonight we are going to work out how that is possible, how the emergency stop on a nuclear reactor could be the very thing that blows it apart. Because this is not a story about a careless operator pushing the wrong control. The button did exactly what it was built to do, and it exploded the reactor anyway. The horror of Chernobyl is not that someone made a mistake. It is that the machine had a flaw so deep that its own safety system was secretly a detonator and almost no one operating it knew. To understand it, you have to understand three things that were all quietly true about that reactor before anyone touched anything, and when they lined up, that button had nowhere to send the reactor but up. Let us start with the reactor itself because it was strange. A Soviet design called the RBMK, and it did something that almost no reactor in the West was allowed to do. Inside any reactor, you have a nuclear chain reaction. Neutrons splitting atoms of uranium, releasing energy and more neutrons, which split more atoms. To keep that reaction going at a steady, useful rate, you have to control the neutrons. And there are two things inside a reactor that affect them. The moderator, which slows neutrons down and helps the reaction along, and the coolant, the water flowing through to carry away the heat. In most Western reactors, the water is both the coolant and the moderator. This gives you a beautiful built-in safety feature. If the reactor starts running too hot and the water boils into steam, you lose your moderator, and the reaction naturally slows down. The reactor has a self-correcting brake built into its physics. Too hot means less reaction. It fights its own overheating. The RBMK did the opposite. It used water as the coolant, but solid graphite as the moderator. And this changes everything, because now the water is not helping the reaction. In this design, the water is mostly getting in the way, absorbing neutrons that would otherwise keep the reaction going. So watch what happens when an RBMK gets too hot and its water boils into steam. You lose water. But the water was the thing holding the reaction back, so losing it doesn't slow the reaction down, it speeds it up. More steam, more reactivity, more heat, more steam, even more reactivity. This is called a positive void coefficient, and it is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. It means the reactor, under the wrong conditions, does not fight its own overheating, it amplifies it. It has a built-in accelerator instead of a built-in brake. Western safety rules essentially forbid this behavior. The Soviet RBMK had the highest positive void coefficient of any commercial reactor ever built. That is flaw number one, and it was baked into the concrete. But on a normal day, at full power, it was manageable. To turn it into a bomb, you needed the reactor to be pushed into a strange and unstable state first. And that is exactly what a safety test did in the hours before the explosion. Here's the bitter irony at the heart of the whole disaster. The crew that night were not doing anything reckless for its own sake. They were running a safety test. They wanted to check whether, in a blackout, the spinning momentum of the turbine could power the coolant pumps for the minute or so it took the backup generators to start. A genuinely sensible thing to want to know. A test about making the plant safer. But to run it, they had to hold the reactor at low power for a long time. And a reactor held too long at low power runs into a problem. A substance called xenon builds up inside the core. Xenon is a neutron absorber. It soaks up neutrons and smothers the reaction like a wet blanket thrown over a fire. Normally, at full power, the reactor burns this xenon away as fast as it forms. But at low power, the xenon accumulates and starts choking the reaction. The reactor's power began to sag, and then to plummet far below where the test needed it. Now the operators were in a hole. Their power had collapsed, and they were under pressure to complete the test. So to claw the power back up, to fight through the xenon smothering the core, they did the one thing that would prove fatal. They pulled the control rods out. Almost all of them. The control rods are the brakes of the reactor. They are rods full of a neutron-absorbing material, boron, that you push into the core to slow the reaction and pull out to speed it up. On a normal reactor, you keep a healthy number of them inserted at all times as a safety margin. That night, fighting the xenon, the operators withdrew almost every rod they had. The rulebook required a minimum number to stay in the core. They went far below it. The reactor was now running with almost nothing holding it back, a machine with a built-in accelerator, running with its brakes pulled almost entirely out, choked with xenon, in its most unstable possible state. And it was in this state, power clawed back to a fragile, unstable level, nearly every control rod withdrawn, the whole core balanced on a knife edge, that they finished the test and moved to shut the reactor down. Which meant pressing the button. It is worth pausing on that control room for a moment, because the people in it were not monsters, and they were not fools. They were tired. It was the early hours of the morning, at the end of a long and frustrating shift that had already run into trouble. They were under real pressure to complete the test. It had been delayed once already, and no one wanted to be the person who failed to finish it. Overseeing them was a deputy chief engineer who, by most accounts, pushed hard to press on despite the reactor behaving strangely. And crucially, everything on their instruments told them the situation, while awkward, was under control. Their training told them that shutting the reactor down was always the safe move, the fallback that could never make things worse. They did not see a bomb in front of them. They saw a difficult test that was nearly over and a big red button that would, they believed, safely bring the whole thing to rest. Every assumption they had been given about their own machine was about to betray them at once. And now we arrive at the third flaw, the one almost no one knew about, the one hiding inside the shutdown button itself. The control rods were made mostly of boron, the neutron absorber, but they had a design detail at the bottom. Each rod was tipped with graphite, and graphite, remember, is the moderator, the thing that speeds the reaction up. Why would you put an accelerator on the tip of your brake? There were engineering reasons in the original design, but the consequence was catastrophic. Because of that graphite tip, when a fully withdrawn control rod first begins to enter the core, the very first thing to slide in is not the boron that slows the reaction. It is the graphite that speeds it up. For the first few seconds of insertion, before the boron reaches deep enough to do its job, each rod actually increases the reaction rate. Now put it all together, in the order it happened. The reactor is in its most unstable state, choked with xenon, nearly every rod pulled out, its positive void coefficient waiting. The operator presses the emergency shutdown button, the command to drive all the control rods into the core at once to kill the reaction, and every one of those rods enters the core graphite tip first. So at the exact moment the system is trying to shut the reactor down, the tips of hundreds of rods flood the core with the graphite that speeds the reaction up. The reactivity, instead of dropping, spikes, and in a reactor with the RBMK's positive void coefficient, that spike boils the water, which, because of that flaw, increases the reactivity further, which boils more water, which increases it more. In about 3 seconds, the power output of the reactor rose from a low level to something like 10 times its normal maximum, and then far beyond. The fuel shattered, the water flashed instantly to steam, and the reactor tore itself apart in a steam explosion that blew the 1,000-ton lid clean off the top of the core and ripped open the building. Moments later, a second explosion followed, and the exposed graphite caught fire, spewing radioactive material miles into the sky, where the wind carried it across Ukraine, Belarus, and much of Europe. The button meant to save the reactor had detonated it. Now, it is important to be honest about what this story does and does not mean, because Chernobyl is often told as pure human villainy or pure machine failure, and it was neither. It was both, locked together. The operators made serious mistakes. They drove the reactor into a forbidden state. They pulled out too many rods, ignored safety margins, and pushed on with a test when they should have stopped. If they had followed every rule, the disaster would not have happened. That is true. But, and this is the crucial part, a well-designed reactor should not be able to explode because someone pushes its emergency stop. No matter what state the operators had put it in, the one action that should always unconditionally be safe is the command to shut down. The shutdown is the thing you reach for when everything else has failed. And the RBMK had a shutdown system that, in the wrong conditions, did the opposite of shutting down. That is not an operator error. That is a flaw so fundamental it defies belief. And here is the detail that turns tragedy into something closer to a crime. The operators did not know the dangerous behavior of the control rods. The fact that the emergency button could spike the reactor before shutting it down was known to some Soviet scientists. It had even shown up in a lesser incident at another RBMK plant years earlier. But the information was classified, buried, kept from the very people whose lives and whose cities depended on it. The men in that control room pressed the button believing it was their salvation. They had never been told it could be their execution. That is the real lesson of Chernobyl, and it is bigger than nuclear power. It is about what happens when a system hides its own flaws, when the truth about a danger is treated as more embarrassing than the danger itself. The RBMK's problems were known. The positive void coefficient was known. The graphite tip flaw was known, but admitting them would have meant admitting that a flagship Soviet technology was imperfect, and in a system built on projecting strength, that admission was unacceptable. So the flaws stayed secret, and the people at the controls were left to operate a machine they did not fully understand, trusting a safety system that was secretly a trap. And you can see the shape of that truth most clearly in what happened afterwards. Once the world understood what had actually gone wrong, the remaining RBMK reactors, and there were many still running across the Soviet Union, were not all shut down. They were too important to the power supply to simply abandon. Instead, they were quietly, urgently modified. The control rods were redesigned so the graphite tips could no longer cause that fatal initial spike. More fixed absorbers were added to the core to bring the runaway void behavior under control. The number of control rods required to stay inserted was raised, and the shutdown system was made faster. In other words, every one of the flaws that the Soviet system had insisted did not exist was suddenly provably real enough to require fixing across an entire fleet of reactors. The problems had always been solvable. What had been missing was the willingness to admit they were there. That is the detail that should stay with you. The disaster did not happen because the flaws were impossible to fix. It happened because, for years before that night, it was easier to keep them secret than to correct them, and the correction only came after a city had been evacuated, a region poisoned, and the roof of a reactor thrown into the sky. The reactor did not explode simply because a man pressed a button. It exploded because of a design flaw stacked on a hidden flaw stacked on a culture that could not admit either one. And the button was just the last link in a chain that had been waiting silently to complete itself. When you strip it all away, Chernobyl is not really a story about atoms. It is a story about a lie. A machine was declared safe when it was not. Its weaknesses were hidden to protect a reputation. And in the end, the physics did not care about the reputation. The safest button in the building did exactly what its hidden flaw dictated it would do. The most important safety device in a nuclear reactor is not the shutdown button. It is the willingness to tell the truth about how the machine can fail. Chernobyl had the first and lacked the second, and that far more than any single push of a button is what blew the reactor apart.